The charred skeleton of a prairie schooner wagon lay twisted in the Kansas dust, like the broken ribs of some ancient forgotten beast. Black smoke, thick and oily, still curled from its smoldering timbers, a desperate signal rising toward a blood-red sunset that bled across the horizon. It was into this tableau of violence and loss that Makia Eagle's long shadow fell stretching over the parched earth to touch the two small figures huddled beside the wreckage. They were girls no older than 16 and 10. The elder one gripped a heavy Winchester rifle with hands far too small for its weight, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. Her chin was set, her gaze a piece of sharpened flint, but the tremor in her arms betrayed the terror she fought to contain. The younger girl was on the ground, a small, fragile heap of calico and pain. She pressed a crimson-soaked cloth against a wound in her side, a wound that painted the ground beneath her like spilled wine on a dusty floor. Both of them stared at him, their eyes wide and hollow, reflecting the terrible knowledge of what men could do to the innocent. Makia halted his horse, a stoic buckskin that stood unbothered by the scent of death. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and measured, meant to convey peace. He held his hands out, palms open and empty, a gesture as old as the plains themselves. The sun caught the high cheekbones of his face, a face carved from two worlds, the sharp angles of his Lakota mother and the weathered lines of his white father. His eyes, dark and deep-set, took in the scene not with shock, but with a profound and weary sorrow. He had seen this before, too many times. "I'm not here to harm you," he said, his voice low and calm like the rumble of distant thunder. It was a voice that rarely rose, for he believed quiet words carried farther. The older girl didn't waver. The rifle's barrel remained fixed on his chest. "Get back on your horse," she commanded, her voice thin but laced with steel. "Ride on. Your sister needs a doctor." Makia stated, his gaze shifting to the younger girl, whose breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. "We don't need anything from you." Makia took another slow step forward. The rifle's hammer clicked back with a sound that was deafening in the sudden quiet of the prairie. The buzzards had already begun to circle high above black specks in an endless, indifferent blue sky. He stopped. He saw the bodies, then half hidden by the wagon's wreckage. A man and a woman, their parents, he presumed. They had not died peacefully. The world had narrowed to this single brutal point, two orphans, a rifle, and the dying light. It was then he saw it. The younger girl, Emily, whimpered, and her small hand tightened its grip on something she clutched to her chest. A glint of silver caught the last rays of the sun. It was a locket, small and oval, etched with the delicate shape of a songbird. The sight struck Makia with the force of a physical blow. The air left his lungs. The prairie blurred the smoke and the blood and the fear, all receding into a dull haze. He was no longer in Kansas. He was standing in the ashes of his own past, smelling the smoke of his own burned-out cabin, seeing that same silver locket in the small, lifeless hand of his own daughter, Amai. The memory was a ghost that had haunted his every waking moment for 5 years, a cold companion on his lonely travels. He had been running from it, trying to outride a grief that had its spurs dug deep into his soul. But here it was, risen from the dust, staring back at him from the hand of a dying child. The older girl saw the change in his eyes. The hardness in his expression had shattered, replaced by a raw, unguarded pain. She saw not a threat, but a man broken by a sorrow she was only just beginning to understand. "Please," he whispered the word, a ragged piece of his soul. "Let me help her." His plea was not for them. It was for himself. In that moment, helping these girls was not a choice. It was a compulsion, a desperate, irrational need to rewrite the ending of a story that had already been written in ash and tears. He could not save his own family, but God as his witness, he would save this one. The rifle barrel lowered just an inch, but it was enough. The tension broke, and the vast, crushing silence of the plains rushed back in. Sarah, the older girl, finally let the facade of strength crumble, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She nodded. Makia moved with a swift, practiced urgency. He knelt beside Emily, his large, gentle hands examining the wound. It was a deep gash from a knife, ugly and inflamed, but the bleeding had slowed. He opened his saddlebag, retrieving a clean cloth, a flask of whiskey to sterilize, and a small tin of salve made from yarrow and pine sap, an old remedy his mother had taught him. "What's your name?" he asked the older girl as he worked. "Sarah," she answered, her voice now barely a whisper. "Her name is Emily." "I'm Makia," he said, pouring a trickle of whiskey onto the wound. Emily cried out a thin, pained sound that twisted a knife in Makia's heart. He murmured soothing words, in a language she wouldn't understand, the soft, flowing syllables of the Lakota tongue words, meant to calm a frightened spirit. He bandaged the wound tightly, then lifted the small girl into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. He carried her to his horse and gently settled her in the saddle before mounting behind her, cradling her against his chest. "There's a town," he said to Sarah, who was now retrieving a small canvas sack from the wreckage. "Redemption Creek, about a day's ride east. There's a doctor there." Sarah looked back at the smoldering wagon, at the two still forms lying in the dust. Her face was a mask of cold fury. They took everything she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Our horses, our money. They just burned it all." "Who did?" Makia asked, his eyes scanning the tracks around the wagon. 4 riders shod horses heading east. They weren't trying to hide their trail. They were arrogant men. Sarah spat as if the word itself were a curse. "One of them. He was dressed like a gentleman. He spoke soft, but his eyes were cold as a snake's. He told my pa he was making a final offer for our land." Makia's jaw tightened. He knew the story. It was being written all across the plains. Powerful men backed by money from the east, clearing the way for railroads and empires, crushing anyone who stood in their way. He looked down at the silver locket still clutched in Emily's hand. This was different. This felt personal. For him, it now was. "We'll get to Redemption Creek," he said, his voice hardening with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "We'll get her well. And then Sarah. We'll find them." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw not just a stranger, but an ally, an instrument of the justice she so desperately craved. She slung the heavy rifle over her shoulder, her small frame straightening with purpose. She would walk beside his horse, her boots kicking up the same dust that had claimed her parents. The journey would be long, and the destination uncertain. But for the first time since the smoke had cleared, she was not alone. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep purple twilight. A cold wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the promise of a reckoning. The journey to Redemption Creek was a silent pilgrimage through a land that offered no comfort. The heat shimmering off the cracked earth, where buzzards circled like burnt specks in an endless sky, gave way to a night so cold and vast it seemed to swallow the pinprick of light from their small campfire. Makia moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who was more at home in the wilderness than in any town. He found a small, sheltered arroyo for them to rest the rock walls, offering a meager defense against the biting wind. He gave Sarah his bedroll and sat with his back against the cold stone, Emily wrapped in his saddle blanket and cradled in his lap. The girl's fever had climbed, and she murmured fitfully in her sleep, her small body trembling. Every pained whimper was a fresh echo of Makia's own failure, a reminder of the night he had sat just like this, holding his own daughter as a fever stole the life from her, a sickness that had come weeks after the fire. A final cruel twist of fate. Sarah watched him from across the fire, her suspicion warring with a reluctant gratitude. She saw the way he checked Emily's bandage, the gentleness with which he brushed the hair from her feverish brow. He was a paradox, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the rock behind him, yet whose eyes held a sorrow as deep and open as the plains. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked the question, breaking the hours of silence. Makia didn't look at her. He stared into the dancing flames where memories flickered like ghosts. "Trouble finds you whether you look for it or not." He set his voice a low rasp. "Sometimes you just have to face it." It wasn't an answer, not a real one, and they both knew it. The real answer was tied to the silver locket. He had glimpsed a secret he kept locked away in the most guarded corner of his heart. They arrived at Redemption Creek as the sun clawed its way into the morning sky. The town was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the unforgiving landscape. Its splintered boardwalks groaned under the weight of weary travelers, and false hope its saloon doors swinging open to reveal shadows and secrets. False-fronted buildings leaned against each other for support, their paint peeled and faded by the relentless sun. It was a town clinging to existence. By its fingernails, a place where fortunes were sought but rarely found. Their entrance caused a stir. Heads turned. The sight of a half-Indian man carrying a wounded child, followed by a soot-stained girl with a rifle, was enough to stop the town's meager morning commerce. Whispers followed them like a trail of dust. Makia ignored them, his focus singular. He headed straight for a small, neat building with a shingle that read, Dr. Elias Abernathy. The doctor was a kind, aging man, with a gentle face and hands stained with iodine. He took one look at Emily and immediately cleared a cot in his small examination room. As he worked, Makia stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street, watching the town and its inhabitants. He saw the tired faces of homesteaders buying meager supplies, the swagger of ranch hands, the cold, watchful eyes of the men who lingered in the saloon's shade. Sheriff Brody arrived shortly after, a man whose weary posture and tarnished star spoke of a long losing battle with the lawlessness of the frontier. He was a decent man, but outmatched and under-resourced. "Heard you rode in with trouble," Brody said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Trouble found them first," Makia corrected, nodding toward Sarah, who stood rigidly by the door, refusing to leave her sister's side. Makia recounted what he had found, his words sparse and direct. He described the tracks, the nature of the attack, and Sarah's description of the well-dressed man. At the mention of a gentleman, the sheriff's shoulders slumped. Silas Blackwood Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Owns the K&P Land and Cattle Company. Been buying up homesteads all along this valley. Says he's bringing progress. Looks more like he's bringing graves. His methods are illegal," Makia stated. "Proving it is another matter," the sheriff retorted. "Blackwood's got lawyers' money and a crew of hard men on his payroll. I've got a town full of scared people and one deputy who's more interested in the saloon's whiskey than he is in justice." Dr. Abernathy emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The girl will live," he announced, and the relief that washed over Sarah was so profound, her legs buckled. Makia caught her arm, steadying her. "The wound was deep and it's infected. She's weak from fever and loss of blood, but she's a fighter. She needs rest, clean bandages, and broth. She can stay here as long as necessary." With the immediate crisis past, a new, heavier reality settled in. Sarah and Emily were alone, with nothing to their names but the clothes on their backs and a deed to a smoking ruin. That evening, as Emily slept a medicated, peaceful sleep for the first time in days, Sarah found Makia by the livery checking on his horse. The setting sun painted the dusty street in hues of orange and gold, a beautiful lie that hid the town's harsh truths. She held out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper. It was a land deed. "This is all we have left," she said, her voice regaining some of its earlier fire. "Our homestead. The land is good. There's a creek. It's worth something." Makia looked at the paper, then at her determined face. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" "I don't need a hero," she said, the words sharp and clear. "I need a tracker. I want you to find the men who did this. I want the one they call Blackwood. I'll pay you with the only thing we have left." Makia's first instinct was to refuse. His tracking days were over. He had shed his past like a snake sheds its skin, leaving the badge and the gun behind. He had been a U.S. Marshal, once a hunter of men, and it had cost him everything. The trail he had followed had led straight to the fire that consumed his world. He wanted no part of it again. He started to shake his head to form the words that would send her away. But then an image flashed in his mind, the silver locket, the small pale hand. He saw Amai's face, not as she was in the end, but as she had been full of life, her laughter like the song of the bird on the locket. He felt the crushing weight of his own guilt, the ghost of the promise he had made to his wife Lena to always protect their child. A promise he had failed to keep. This wasn't about Sarah's land. It wasn't about her justice. It was about his own. He looked at the fierce, desperate girl before him and saw a chance, however slim, for a different ending. He took the deed from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. But he didn't look at the paper. He folded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Keep your land," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with a newfound dangerous purpose. Justice shouldn't have a price. The next morning, Makia rode back to the ashes of the homestead. The sun was hot, the silence absolute, broken only by the buzz of flies. He dismounted and began his work, his mind falling into the familiar rhythms of the hunt. The world of men with its lies and grief faded away. Here there was only the earth and the story it told. He walked the scene not as a man, but as a reader. The ground was a page, and he knew its language. He saw the deep, confident prints of 4 horses confirming their number. 3 of the horses were shod with standard iron. But the fourth was different. The print was finer, the shoe custom-made with a distinctive V-shaped nick in the left forehoof. The mark of a blacksmith who took pride in his work, or a rider who demanded the best. This was the horse of the leader, the gentleman. Near the spot where Sarah's father had fallen, he found what the killers had missed. A half-smoked cheroot, its end clipped clean by a silver cutter. The brand was expensive, imported from the east. This was not the smoke of a common ranch hand. He followed the trail east, as Sarah had said. The riders had made no effort to conceal their path. They had ridden with the arrogance of men who believed they were above consequences, an arrogance that often bred carelessness. Miles later, the trail split. 3 sets of tracks veered north toward the rough country where hired guns often made their camps. The 4th set, the one with the nicked shoe, continued east directly toward Redemption Creek. Makia returned to town with a cold certainty settling in his gut. Blackwood wasn't just directing his men. He was present. He was a man who liked to watch his work unfold. The heart of Redemption Creek was its saloon, a place that smelled of stale beer sweat and desperation. Makia pushed through the swinging doors and was met with a sudden silence. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Conversations died. All eyes fell on him. He was an outsider, a man of 2 worlds, who belonged in neither, and in a town this tense, the unknown was a threat. He ignored the stares and walked to the bar, ordering a whiskey he had no intention of drinking. He stood and listened, letting the nervous chatter resume around him. He heard men grumbling about Blackwood's latest land, grabbed the unfair prices, the subtle threats that came with every offer. They spoke in hushed tones, their fear a palpable thing. A burly man with a cruel face and a pistol slung low on his hip swaggered up to the bar. His spurs jingled with every step. Makia recognized him from the wanted posters he'd seen in his past life. Jed, a hired gun with a reputation for brutality. He was exactly the kind of man a person like Blackwood would employ. Jed leaned against the bar, his eyes raking over Makia with open contempt. "Ain't seen you around here before," he drawled. Makia didn't turn. He stared at his own reflection in the murky mirror behind the bar. "Just passing through." "This town ain't for passing through," Jed sneered. "It's for people who know their place. You got a place, half-breed." The slur hung in the air. The saloon went quiet again. Makia took a slow sip of his whiskey, the burn of it a distant sensation. He had heard that word his whole life. It no longer had the power to wound him. "My place is my own business," Makia said calmly. Jed chuckled a low, ugly sound. "Blackwood's business is this whole valley. And he don't like strangers asking questions." He took a cheroot from his pocket, the same expensive brand Makia had found in the dust, and clipped the end with a silver cutter. It was all the confirmation Makia needed. He placed his glass on the bar with a soft click, turned, and walked out, leaving Jed smirking in his wake. The fight would come, but not here, not now. This was a hunt, and a hunter never strikes until the time is right. Silas Blackwood's office was the only two-story building in town, a monument to his power. It was furnished with a mahogany desk, leather-bound books, and maps of the valley that were already marked with his name. It was a room that smelled of money and ambition. Blackwood himself was a surprise. He was not a brutish cattle baron, but a man of refined elegance. He wore a tailored suit, his silver hair was impeccably groomed, and his hands were soft, uncalloused. When he spoke, his voice was a smooth, cultured baritone that masked a cold, calculating menace. "Mr. Eagle," he said, rising from his desk, with a welcoming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff Brody informed me of your arrival. A tragedy what happened to the Miller family. The frontier can be a harsh and unforgiving place. It's men who are unforgiving." Makia replied, his gaze sweeping the room. He was looking for something, though he wasn't sure what. "Progress, Mr. Eagle, requires sacrifice." Blackwood set his tone that of a patient teacher explaining a simple truth to a dull student. Small, inefficient homesteads must make way for larger, more productive enterprises. It is the natural order of things. A lesson the stubborn are often the last to learn. "The Millers weren't stubborn," Makia said, his voice level. "They were murdered." Blackwood's smile tightened. "An unfortunate allegation. Do you have any proof to support such a claim?" Makia's eyes came to rest on a silver-framed photograph on the corner of the desk. It was slightly faded, a portrait of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a young boy, no older than 7. The woman was beautiful, and around her neck she wore a silver locket etched with the delicate shape of a songbird. The world tilted on its axis. The locket. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. The same unique design, the same chain. It couldn't be a coincidence. Makia felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about progress. It was something else, something deeply personal and twisted. He looked from the photograph to Blackwood's face and saw for the first time the abyss of hatred that lay behind his calm blue eyes. Blackwood saw him looking. For a fleeting second, his mask of civility slipped, revealing a flash of raw, consuming grief. He quickly composed himself. "My late wife and son," he said, his voice suddenly brittle. "They were victims of a different kind of progress, the kind the government calls taming the West. They were collateral damage." Makia felt the blood drain from his face. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he did not want to see. The targeted families, the personal nature of the attacks, the locket. A memory sharp and violent broke through the fog of his mind. A raid on an outlaw camp near the Cimarron River. He was a marshal, then leading a posse. It was supposed to be a simple arrest. But the outlaws opened fire. In the chaos, a lantern was knocked over. The dry timber of a cabin went up like a tinderbox. He remembered the flames, the smoke, the screams. He remembered seeing a woman and a child trapped inside, but the fire was too intense. They couldn't get to them. It was a tragic accident, a ghost that had joined the others in his haunted past. He remembered the name of the outlaw they had been hunting, a man who had escaped the raid. His name was not Blackwood, Or was it men changed their names on the frontier all the time? He had to be sure. He needed to talk to someone who remembered. The town's old blacksmith, a man named Peters, had been on that posse. He found Peters at his forge, hammering a piece of glowing iron into a horseshoe. The old man was stooped and frail, his best years long behind him. When Makia mentioned the Cimarron River raid, a shadow passed over the old man's face. A bad business that was Peters rasped his eyes distant. Never sat right with me. The fire, the woman and kid, they weren't part of the gang. They were just there. Do you remember the outlaw we were after? Makia asked, his voice tight. The one who got away. Peters stopped hammering. He looked at Makia, his eyes full of a dawning horror. His name was Silas. Silas. Black. He was a card sharp, a con man, not a killer. We were only supposed to bring him in for questioning. But Jed was with us that day. He was always hot-headed. He started the shooting. Jed, the same man who now worked for Blackwood. His wife Makia pressed his heart pounding. The woman in the cabin. What did she look like? Pretty woman, Peters said sadly. Dark hair. Wore a little silver locket. A bird on it. There it was. The final damning piece. Silas Black had changed his name to Blackwood, built a fortune and returned. But not for land. For vengeance. The homesteaders he was terrorizing, the families he was destroying. They were the surviving members of Makia's old posse. The Millers were just the last on his list. And Makia, the marshal who had led the raid, was the ultimate prize. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Makia was not the hero in this story. He was the villain. He was the cause of all this suffering, the unwitting architect of Sarah and Emily's pain. His past hadn't just caught up to him. It had ambushed him and torn open wounds he thought had long since scarred over. He walked through the town in a daze, the dusty streets seeming alien and unreal. Every face he saw seemed to be judging him. The weight of his old badge felt like a brand on his soul. He went to the doctor's house, needing to see the girls, needing to ground himself in the present. He found Sarah sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She had cleaned herself up, her hair was brushed, and in the soft light she looked so young, so fragile. She sensed his turmoil immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "What did you find out?" He wanted to tell her. He wanted to confess, to lay the whole ugly truth at her feet. But the words wouldn't come. How could he tell this girl who looked at him with something approaching trust that her family had died because of a ghost from his past, that he was the reason her world had been burned to the ground? Blackwood is responsible. He said the words feeling like a lie, an incomplete truth. But it's more complicated than that. His evasion created a rift between them. The fragile trust she had placed in him began to fray. Complicated how she demanded. "He killed my parents. He tried to kill my sister." There is nothing complicated about that. Before he could answer, the door opened, and Jed stepped out onto the porch, a smug grin on his face. Two of his men stood behind him, their hands resting on their pistols. "Blackwood wants to see you," Eagle Jed said, his eyes glittering with malice. "And he'd like the girl to come along too, as an invitation." Jed grabbed Sarah's arm. She cried out, struggling against his iron grip. Makia's hand flew to the pistol he now wore, a relic of a life he thought he had left behind. "Let her go, Jed," Makia said, his voice dangerously low. Jed laughed. "Or what, you'll shoot me? Go ahead. My men will kill you before you hit the ground." And the little sister is all alone inside. Anything could happen. A stray bullet, an overturned lamp. It was a checkmate. Makia's blood ran cold. He was trapped by his own past, forced to relive his greatest failure. A fire, an innocent life at stake. "Blackwood's waiting for you." Jed sneered, dragging a terrified Sarah with him. At the Miller homestead, He wants you to see the place where it all ends. For you, Makia stood frozen on the porch to the echoes of Jed's laughter mocking him. He was alone, facing a man whose entire existence was now dedicated to his destruction. And this time, he couldn't run. He had to ride back into the fire, back to the source of his pain, and confront the ghost of Silas Black. The ride to the Miller homestead was a journey into the heart of a storm, both in the sky and in Makia's soul. The wind rose with a mournful howl, whipping dust and grit into the air, obscuring the landscape in a suffocating ochre haze. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now a bruised, angry purple. It was a fitting backdrop for the reckoning that awaited him. His mind was a maelstrom of guilt and regret. He saw the raid at Cimarron River with a terrible newfound clarity. He saw himself younger Brasher, confident in the righteousness of his badge. He saw the chaos, the shouting, the gunfire that erupted without his command. He saw Jed, his face contorted in a wild fury, firing recklessly into the camp. And he saw the lantern fall a small, terrible accident that had spiraled into a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. He hadn't started the fire, but he had led the charge. The sin was his to bear. The burned-out homestead was a skeletal silhouette against the darkening sky. The wind shrieked through the charred remains of the house, a chorus of ghostly voices. The barn, however, was still standing, a dark, hulking shape against the storm. A single flickering lantern cast a sickly yellow glow from its open doorway. That was where Blackwood was waiting. Makia dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He drew his Colt, the cold, familiar weight of it, a grim comfort. He was a marshal again, not by law, but by necessity. He walked toward the barn, the wind tearing at his clothes, the sand stinging his eyes. Inside the scene was a carefully constructed piece of theater. Sarah was tied to a support beam in the center of the barn, her face pale with terror. Silas Blackwood stood before her, not as the refined gentleman from the office, but as a specter of vengeance. His tailored suit was disheveled, his silver hair whipped into disarray by the wind. In his hand, he held a single-shot Derringer, its small barrel pointed at Sarah's head. Jed stood off to the side, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The only other object of note in the cavernous space was an old mantelpiece clock salvaged from the house. It sat on a crate, its pendulum swinging its loud, rhythmic ticking, a maddening metronome, counting down the final seconds. "Welcome home, Marshal Blackwood," said his voice, cutting through the howl of the wind. Or should I say, welcome back to the fire. It has a certain symmetry, don't you think? "Let her go, Blackwood." Makia said, his pistol steady, aimed at the center of Blackwood's chest. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it is far too late for that," Blackwood replied with a chilling calm. "This was always about more than just you. It was about making you understand. I want you to feel what I felt that day. The utter soul-crushing helplessness of watching everything you love be consumed by flames, knowing you are powerless to stop it." He gestured around the barn. "I watched my wife Eleanor and my son Thomas die because you and your pack of government-sanctioned killers brought hell to our doorstep. Tonight you will watch this girl die, and you will carry that with you into eternity." The moral dilemma was a vice squeezing the air from Makia's lungs. His own code, the one he had tried to live by since the fire, demanded he protect the innocent. But the raw, primal part of him, the part that had festered in guilt for 5 years, screamed for vengeance against the man who had tormented him. To kill Blackwood would be to satisfy his own demons, but it would risk Sarah's life. To save her, he might have to surrender to give Blackwood the victory he craved. "It was an accident," Silas Makia said, his voice strained. "A tragedy. I never wanted your family to be harmed." Blackwood let out a laugh that was closer to a sob. "An accident? You call burning a woman and child alive an accident? There are no accidents, Marshal. Only actions and consequences." It was then that Jed, ever the instigator, decided to pour salt on the wound. He sauntered forward, his arrogance blinding him to the shifting dynamics in the room. "He's got you there," Eagle Jed sneered. "But you know, Silas, you never did have the whole story straight." Blackwood's head snapped toward his foreman. "What are you talking about, Jeddy?" Jed's smile widened. He was enjoying this, holding the stage, the master of everyone's fate. "You're Eleanor," he said, savoring the words. "She wasn't quite the innocent victim you've spent all these years mourning. She was singing to the lost Silas. She was an informant. She was the one who told the marshals where to find our camp. She sold you out for a promise of a new life somewhere else." The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder each second, a hammer blow against the sudden, stunned silence. Blackwood stared at Jed, his face a mask of disbelief. "You're lying," Blackwood whispered. "Am I?" Jed's eyes gleamed with cruel triumph. "I was there, remember? I heard her talking to one of the deputies a week before. When the raid started, I knew what I had to do. Couldn't have her telling them everything, could we? That lantern didn't just fall over by accident." He made a small kicking motion with his foot. "I kicked it over, right into a stack of hay. She was singing to the lost Silas. I just shut her up for good. The marshals were a convenient scapegoat for a problem I needed to solve." The revelation struck Blackwood like a bolt of lightning, shattering the very foundation of his being. His entire crusade, his 5 years of meticulously planned, all-consuming revenge, it was all built on a lie. He had not been avenging a murdered innocent. He had been a pawn in a common outlaw's desperate act of self-preservation. The hatred that had sustained him, that had been the sole purpose of his existence, evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, desolate void. His arm dropped the derringer, falling from his limp fingers and clattering to the dusty floor. His face crumpled, the face of a man whose soul had just been ripped out. In that moment of chaos, Makia saw his choice. It wasn't about revenge or redemption anymore. It was simpler. It was about saving the girl. He didn't fire at the broken man before him. He shifted his aim, his pistol barking, once the shot echoing like a thunderclap inside the barn. The bullet tore through Jed's gun hand, sending his pistol flying into the shadows. Jed screamed in pain and fury, clutching his bleeding hand. Makia moved, a blur of motion, crossing the barn in 3 long strides. He cut Sarah free with his knife as the storm outside reached its crescendo, a furious shriek of wind and sand that rattled the very walls of the barn. He pushed her behind him, standing between her and the 2 men who had destroyed her family. The confrontation was over. The violence had ended, not with a climactic gunfight, but with the quiet, devastating implosion of a man's soul brought down by the weight of a terrible truth. Just as the storm outside began to break, the barn doors burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, flanked by a small posse of grim-faced townsmen, their lanterns cutting through the dust-filled air. They had been drawn by the sound of the shot. They found a scene of strange, quiet aftermath. Jed was on the floor, cursing and clutching his shattered hand. Silas Blackwood was on his knees, staring into nothing, a man completely and utterly broken, his quest for revenge having ended in the most empty of tragedies. Makia stood protectively in front of Sarah, his pistol still held at the ready, his face a mask of weary resolve. There were no more words to be said. Sheriff Brody and his men took control. Jed was hauled to his feet, still spitting threats and profanities, and arrested. Blackwood offered no resistance. He was led away like a man in a trance, his empire of vengeance crumbling to dust around him. As the posse cleared out, Makia knelt before Sarah, who was shivering more from shock than from cold. He gently took the rifle from her hands. "It's over," he said softly. She looked at him, her eyes searching, as full of questions he knew he had to answer. "You knew," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew it was about you. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because the truth wouldn't have changed what needed to be done," he said, his own voice heavy with the burden of that truth. "And because I was ashamed." He told her everything then, under the leaking roof of her family's barn, as the rain from the dying storm began to fall, washing the dust from the air. He told her about the Cimarron raid, about his posse, about her father's unknowing part in a tragedy that had happened years ago. He laid his soul bare, offering no excuses, only the plain, ugly facts. It was a difficult and painful confession, but it was a necessary one. It was the only way to truly end the cycle of violence that had ensnared them all. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she didn't speak for a long time. She simply looked at him, a girl forced to bear a weight of history far too heavy for her young shoulders. Finally, she gave a single slow nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was understanding. And for now that was enough. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over Redemption Creek. With Blackwood's influence gone, the town seemed to take a collective breath. The homesteaders he had terrorized began to speak openly, their fear replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild. Emily's fever broke, and color returned to her cheeks, her resilience a small, bright beacon of hope. Makia found his own peace in a different way. One afternoon, he walked to the town's small, windswept cemetery. He bypassed the neat rows of marked graves and went to a simple, unadorned section at the back, a place for the unnamed and the forgotten. There were no headstones here to mark the resting place of his wife, Lena, and his daughter, Amai, for their bodies had been lost to the fire. But he knew they were here in his heart. He stood before a patch of earth where a single stubborn wildflower grew, and for the first time in 5 years, he spoke to them not in the silent language of guilt, but with his voice. Lena, Amai, he began the names, feeling strange and sacred on his tongue. I'm sorry. Not for the raid. Not for the accident. I am sorry for letting my grief turn your memory into a ghost. I let it haunt me, and in my running, I let it hurt others. I see that now. You were my life, my love. I will carry you with me always, not as a burden, but as a light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth river stone, placing it gently at the base of the flower. Rest now. As he walked away, he felt a profound shift within him. The crushing weight that had hunched his shoulders for so long had finally lifted. He was not absolved, but he was no longer a prisoner of his past. Sheriff Brody met him at the cemetery gate. He held out a small silver star, a deputy's badge. The town could use a man like you, Makia, he said earnestly. A man who understands that justice is more than just a word. Makia looked at the badge, the symbol of the life that had cost him so much. He saw the path it offered a return to hunting men, to enforcing a law that was often blind and brutal. He then looked toward the town, toward the doctor's house, where 2 orphaned girls were starting to heal. He knew with absolute certainty which path was his. He gently pushed the sheriff's hand away. Thank you, Sheriff, he said, his voice firm but polite. But I'm done chasing men. There are other things that need building. He returned to the Miller land, not as a tracker or a gunslinger, but as a builder. He found Sarah and Emily there with Dr. Abernathy and a few other townsfolk salvaging what they could from the wreckage. He walked past them and into the nearby woods, his keen eyes scanning the trees. He used his tracking skills not to hunt a man, but to find a tall, sturdy oak one with a strong heart and deep roots, perfect for the main beam of a new home. As they laid the foundation stones for the small new cabin, Makia took a moment for himself. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his old tarnished U.S. Marshal's badge. It felt heavy in his palm, a relic of a different man. With a quiet reverence, he placed it into the wet mortar between 2 large foundation stones, covering it with another layer of stone and cement. He was burying his past, not to forget it, but to build a future upon it. Weeks later, the new house stood small but strong, and the scent of fresh-cut pine mingling with the smell of the prairie. The community, healed by the fall of Blackwood, had come together to help the two girls who had lost everything. On a bright, clear afternoon, Makia stood with Sarah in the yard. He had her father's Winchester in his hands. He showed her how to stand, how to breathe, how to hold the rifle so it felt like an extension of her own will. "You hold it steady," he instructed, his voice calm and patient. He adjusted her stance, his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not with anger, with purpose. "You don't use this for revenge. You use it to protect, to build, to make sure no one can ever take your home away from you again." She looked at him, her eyes clear and strong. She nodded, understanding the profound lesson he was teaching her, that the cycle of violence could be broken, replaced by one of resilience and hope. She lifted the rifle, took a deep breath, and aimed at a distant target, her grip steady, her purpose clear. Makia watched her, a quiet pride in his eyes. He had not found redemption in the blaze of a gunfight, but in the quiet, steady act of helping a family and a community rebuild from the ashes. His own long, dark trail had finally led him home.